Good evening, my name is Shanaz Saddique and I'm the National Organiser for the Workers' Party and your host this evening. We've got an absolutely fantastic two speakers who will be involved in tonight's broadcast. The title of tonight's broadcast is Europe on the March, and many of you will have watched, I hope, the last 5 programmes that we've had, and today is the 6th programme of No Conscription League. And one of the things that we're looking at is that a whole host of Baltic and Scandinavian countries are now conscripting its people, and the countries such as Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania have introduced military service. And what we are asking the question, is Europe on the march towards war with Russia? We hope to be discussing these questions with our guests this evening, who have got different backgrounds, and most of them extremely interesting to see. And I've been reading some information about the kind of dialogue and the narrative that's been built around this particular subject. And there's a whole array of different perspectives, and what we hope to be able to do is bring you some of those perspectives. Our first guest needs little introduction. He is a writer, journalist and columnist. He also directs a documentary, Standing Army. So he's a great person to discuss conscription with. It's Thomas Fazi, and he joins us live from Rome. Good evening, Thomas.
Hi, Shanaz. Good evening. Thanks for having me on the show.
It's amazing to have you. One of the things that what I hope to be able to discuss with you and get your thoughts on this is that many of the Baltic and Scandinavian countries have introduced conscription. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. Well, I mean, I think as with everything that's happening in Europe lately, I don't think there's a single motivating factor that can explain it. I think there's different factors at play. And I think, people generally look for rational explanations when trying to make sense of politics. But I think especially at times of war, or better, in the periods leading up to war, politics takes on a somewhat irrational nature as well, that I think forces us to also search for deeper explanations than, let's say, simply material or self-interested motivations. And I think this is true for all of Europe these days, but I think it's especially true in the case of the Baltic and Scandinavian countries, whose policies really appear especially irrational. I mean, from a rational standpoint, anyone can see that for these tiny, militarily insignificant countries to adopt this incredibly belligerent stance against this giant nuclear armed power really makes...
Do you think it's because of that, Thomas? Is it because, in particular, that the stance has been taken to actually fight this war against Russia because it's a giant power? Do you think that that's maybe one of the factors behind conscription in these countries?
I think it's definitely sort of one of the. I think it's definitely one of the narratives that's being spun in these countries. But I think it's a narrative that really doesn't make much sense. The idea that somehow you got to ramp up your defenses in order to prepare for what you consider to be a likely invasion, in fact, is likely to become a self-fulfilling prophecy in many ways. I think at the moment, I think it's clear that there's no reason for Russia to attack these countries. It would make no sense from a rational standpoint, from a military, geopolitical, or strategic standpoint, for Russia to attack these countries, or to launch some kind of ground invasion against these countries, or any NATO country for that matter. So I think from a rational perspective, it doesn't make sense. So to me, it seems really like we're witnessing a very similar dynamic to what we saw at play in Ukraine in the years leading up to Russia's 2022 invasion, except on an even sort of more paradoxical scale, because the imbalance of power between the countries in question is even bigger than it was between Ukraine and Russia. But if we look at how that conflict developed, I mean, we see very similar dynamics at play. Ukraine saying, "Oh, Russia is preparing to invade, therefore we have to ramp up our defenses." But of course, that ramping up of Ukraine's defenses, that militarization of Ukraine, the NATOization of Ukraine, is in fact what caused Russia to invade in the first place, an invasion that likely been avoided if Ukraine had adopted a different policy. So we really don't see.
In terms of the policies, just on that, Thomas, policies and narrative, and as you've said, that there's no single reason, and then you've got this maybe philosophical reasons that they try and put to people, and a narrative is created. Yeah. Do you think that Russia is an actual threat? Do you believe to the Baltic and Scandinavian countries, or do you think it's something that's been falsely created, if I may use that?
I mean, I think the idea that Russia has, plans to attack or invade the Baltic countries or the Scandinavian countries, or as I said, really any NATO country, or less so any European country, really makes no sense. It would make no sense for Russia to do that, unless one assumes that Russia is driven by completely sort of irrational motivations. But in fact, I think we've seen, especially over the past 3 years, that in fact Russia's leadership is very rational, definitely much more rational than the NATO leaderships. But I think what's, again, I return to what I was saying earlier, I think what's really concerning is that not only is there no reason to believe that Russia is preparing to invade, but I think if it were to do so, I think there's little these countries could do to stop the Russian army, which means that they would be much better served, I think, by really adopting an opposite policy, which is renormalizing and pacifying relations with Russia, which is the opposite of what they're doing now. And this goes for Europe as a whole, really. I mean, this, all over Europe, we hear European leaders drum up this narrative of sort of Russia preparing to march, into Berlin or Paris. I mean, this makes no sense whatsoever. It's really quite insane. But the paradox is that, as for Ukraine, even though at the moment Russia has no interest in or would have no reason to attack NATO or Europe, by launching these rearmament plans, they're actually, Europe is actually making this option more and more likely. So again, what we risk witnessing kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy once again. And also, I think the most absurd part is perhaps that, if Russia really did, come to the point that reach the conclusion that Europe or NATO represents an existential threat to Russia or is preparing to attack, they would be they might be incentivized to launch a first strike on Europe. But of course, this wouldn't take the form of a ground invasion. It would likely take the form of a missile strike on military, possibly even civilian targets in Europe. And there's nothing Europe could do to stop this. And so this shows that these policies aren't just senseless; they're also, incredibly dangerous.
I mean, just going back to conscription, the fact that this narrative has been created, and let's assume that people are going to start to believe it, or if they're not going to believe it, then they were going to have enforced or mandatory conscription. Do you think that Russia should feel threatened by this, in terms of their neighboring countries, that this is actually happening?
I mean, I think at the moment, Russia, doesn't, view Europe or as an immediate threat. No. Especially given that these conscription plans are, in a very embryonic stage, and I think they'll also be very difficult to implement, especially in Western Europe. But for sure, we know that Russia is following these developments in Europe very, very closely, and is adapting its military and security policies accordingly. And so I think we risk reaching a point where Russia does start viewing Europe as a potential threat to its national security, and given how unhinged the European leaderships are today, I think they wouldn't be completely unreasonable in thinking that. I think we're not at that stage yet, but that's why it's so important to try to stop these to try to stop the war machine in its tracks, because we know from history that that history these events tend to take on a life of their own, and once and may argue that it's already too late. Maybe the train has already left the station, and but we have to hope that we're still in time to stop this. But this means that stopping the war machine is really sort of an existential duty for Europeans nowadays.
Yeah. I mean, it makes these kinds of conversations even more important, doesn't it, in terms of getting that information out to people? I mean, Belarus seems to be the only Eastern European country allied with Russia that has conscription. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, I don't know Belarus that well, but I would imagine that they've possibly maintained kind of an old school Russian-like mentality that emphasizes the importance of military readiness. Even for kind of old school, large-scale conventional warfare, while NATO countries for a very long time have been accustomed to believe that they would never again be involved into large-scale conventional warfare against an equivalent army. Of course, we now know that was not the case, but NATO for a very long time has been accustomed to essentially attacking countries that had greatly inferior military capabilities or non-existent military capabilities, and so they've grown very unaccustomed to just to conventional warfare. Now they're realizing that largely as a result of NATO's own policies, large-scale conventional warfare has returned to the European continent in the form of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and now they're trying to catch up. But again, I mean, we should address the root cause of that conflict and realize that it's not. You don't avoid an even larger scale conventional warfare through armament. You avoid it through diplomacy.
Yes, of course. I mean, Turkey has conscription, and while Turkey is a NATO member and supports Ukraine's sovereignty, it also maintains a strategic ties with Russia, doesn't it? In the event of God forbid, in the event of a World War III, would Turkey be on the side of NATO or would it be on the side of Russia, do you think?
Well, I mean, it's always hard to tell when it comes to Turkey. Turkey's always been a country that plays its own game and actually plays both sides and has its hands in different pies. I think that's more evident than ever nowadays, where, as you were saying, on the one hand it's a member of NATO, but on the other hand it maintains good relations with Russia and other BRICS countries. I think I wouldn't be surprised if it tried to stay out of it. I think we often make too much of Article 5, the NATO's collective self-defense clause, which on paper states that if any NATO country is attacked, then all other NATO countries have a duty to step in support of that country. But I think to expect that to play out exactly as that article states, I think is very naive. I think countries, I think, wouldn't be compelled to intervene in an all-out war just because some treaty signed 80 or so years ago said so. And I think so I think also the idea would act in such a unified way in the event of an actual sort of all-out war with Russia, I think is also sort of a very simplistic way of thinking, especially given that NATO seems to be somewhat disintegrating. I mean, until yesterday, it was pretty clear, that the US was the unquestioned leader of NATO. Nowadays, that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. NATO seems to have somewhat, outgrown the US, or at least the White House, the executive power in the US, even though it's probably still expression of sort of factions of the US security state, of the US imperial state. But nowadays, especially nowadays, it's unclear exactly who is running NATO, and so I think it would be even more naive to expect some automatically unified response from NATO in the event of a conflict.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think that the ever-changing face of NATO, its members, what's happening in the international world, and in particular how countries want to develop or their existing relationships with powers such as Russia. We've mentioned some countries that have already introduced conscription. Do you think others will join from Europe?
I mean, I think they'll try. I mean, there's talk of reintroducing conscription in a number of even Western European countries. We've heard it in Germany, France, even in my country, Italy. There's been some talk, not coming from the government in our case, but in the media about the need or the possibility of reintroducing conscription. Now, I think the reality is that
divided. Is it right, Thomas? That in Italy, your home country, that the actual views on it are quite divided on conscription. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think I'd be very surprised if the country was, I mean, I haven't seen the poll that you're mentioning, but I would be very surprised if the country, and especially young people, were divided about whether they'd be willing to reintroduce conscription and go to war. I think, if asked the question directly, most people will say, no, of course I don't want to go to war. Of course I don't want to go and fight Russia. So I think what these polls conflate is, conscription itself and the individual going to fight with the wider question of whether we have to, prepare for war, or whether we need to boost defenses against Russia. Now, I think people might be divided on that somewhat abstract issue, because large swathes of the population still are kind of brainwashed by the war propaganda. But I think when one goes from the abstract level to the concrete level, I think people's opinions shift very quickly. And so I think there's also this again, I think a lot of people in the West really have a hard time grappling with the reality of war. I think they think of war in very abstract terms, and I think you can see this even in the course of individual interviews with people, where they will ask them, "Do you support, a European army, for example?" And a lot of even young people will say, "Oh yeah, that's a great idea." And then the next question will be, "Okay, so would you be ready to go and fight, Russia?" Well, no. I mean, I wouldn't, but I still think that a European army is a good idea. So I think, there's a lot of, I think people have a very schizophrenic attitude to this, because they really have a hard time grappling with the reality of war, because we haven't known the reality of war for so long in the West. And I think that's actually part of the problem.
And I think perhaps you would agree with me, Thomas, that many of the people that it will affect will be people that have no real there'll be no connection with war, other than maybe what they've read or seen in movies, so they don't really understand it, and they're the ones that are going to be most affected. Now, according to France 24, a YouGov poll in early March showed that Italians are divided on conscription, so that's why I mentioned that.
Right.
The same poll found that 86% of French supported the reinstallment of military service. So it's quite interesting in terms of, we talk about the narrative, the question that is asked, who you ask, and what one thing leads to another. Why do you think then that there's a much larger percentage of French people are for conscription or military service than the Italians? Why do you think there's a difference there?
I don't know. I mean, I'd really like to take a sort of a better look at these polls and exactly what questions were posed, because I'd be very surprised if almost 90% of French people are really in favor of reintroducing conscription. I mean, I think one could maybe explain that in terms of the French having a greater sense of national pride than maybe Italy. I mean, I don't know if that plays a role, but again, I think we have to go back to the earlier question of, I mean, we also know that I've seen polls come out of France, which show that a large part of the population is also opposed to sort of rearmament plans and this kind of warmongering approach to Russia. And so these various poles don't exactly seem to collide with each other. And so I think a lot of it has to do with sort of the very compartmentalized way people have to think about these issues, I think. But I think one of the paradoxes is, especially, that nowadays they're trying to sort of drum up sort of kind of a European sort of sense of some collective sense of identity, and even a supranational pride, but of course they've spent the past 30 years trying to really demolish any idea, the idea that there was any benefit in concepts like taking pride in your nation, taking pride in your country. And so I think in a way that now your European elites are victims also of their own sort of propaganda, years of depoliticization, of telling people that actually caring for your country or believing in your country is actually a reactionary concept. I think doesn't have, maybe we should maybe thank them for that, because I think that's one of the reasons why today very few people would be willing to go and fight for their countries. But I think
these things naturally fall hand in hand. Should we be using, I'm playing the devil's advocate here now, so should we be using the word sort of national pride, sovereignty, and having that sense of collectiveness and in being together? Because if you're not, are you then not proud of your nation? Are you then sort of anti-English or anti-Italian or whatever, even though you may be born and brought up there? So my question is that, do they necessarily fall hand in hand, or is it something that we are led to believe because of the narrative that's been created?
I think you can take pride in your nation for a number of reasons, and not just the one, not just according to the frameworks that are that we often hear in the public public debates. And but I think I was just trying to make the point really that it's harder to it's harder to get to mobilize people for war if you've been telling them for the past 30 years that that they shouldn't that they shouldn't really care that much about their own country, that that they shouldn't have that sense of national pride, which I think definitely helps if you're trying to mobilize large parts of the population for war, to go and sort of fight for their country. And of course we know that that's also a lie. I mean people are never sent to die for their country. They're usually sent to die for the interests of the elites, the interests of the oligarchies, the interests of the capitalist class. But I think also, this also plays a role in why today would be very hard, I think, to launch sort of large scale conscription policies across Europe. And that's also because people have less faith in their in their leaders and the political leadership than they've probably ever had throughout history. And so it's hard to imagine that people would be willing to go and fight and die for people like Macron, for people like Merz, for people like Starmer, politicians who we know have very little legitimacy, enjoy very little consensus in the eyes of the people. And so in a way, I think again we're seeing the kind of European elites being victims in a way of their own kind of elite-driven depoliticizing policies. I mean, this is all well and good when you're trying to keep the population apathetic and you're trying to keep them out of politics, but I think it makes it very hard then to mobilize people to go and to go and fight for you. And so I think that's
you mentioned our existing political leaders and maybe their charisma or personalities or their sort of existence and how they've got there perhaps plays a role in that. But do you think that the Second World War itself plays a part in the minds of people in terms of when they're looking at conscription and in their respective countries and where they're sitting? Do you think that in itself plays a role?
Well, I think it doesn't, and I think that's probably part of the problem. I mean, I think part of the tragedy of our age is that we've lost the memory of the collective memory of the tragedy of the Second World War. That's been completely wiped out from the collective consciousness. And I think partly also purely for kind of generational reasons. I mean, there's very, very few people left from the generation that actually experienced that war. And so soon we're not going to have anyone who's going to be able to recount directly the horrors of World War II. And of course, that's still the people that went through the horrors of World War II. It's largely, they were the ones that largely kept the memory of the war alive, and reminded people why we had to do everything in our power to avoid that kind of war from happening again. And I think and we don't we've been losing that for several years, and I think now it's been, as I was saying, almost completely wiped out from our consciousness. And this relates to what I was saying earlier, the fact that we really have a hard time in the West grappling with what war truly means. I think and even the fact that we're constantly subject to it, on our cell phones, on social media, at least in terms of, in visual terms, in video terms, in a way that makes us even more desensitized to the reality of war. I mean, as if we've almost become, unable to distinguish between, reality and fiction. And I think there's probably a case to be made that that's maybe always been the case. I think there's maybe a case to be made that wars happen cyclically, and I think more in general, nations and countries decay cyclically every few generations because the memory of the past war and of what was needed to prevent them is forgotten. And that's when you fall, when you forget the past, then that's when you start repeating the same mistakes.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with you. I think the stories that are told and the stories that evolve around us, and I think the era that we're in now, and the information that we have. I mean, you're a journalist and economist. That the array of information that we have is something that we can't move away from. And whereas depending upon where you're from, the lifestyle that you have, you may have a consciousness about it that is now. But I think history itself has a lot of answers that still haven't actually been given to people, and people are aware of that. Thomas, it's been great speaking to you, and I hope that you will join the program down in future weeks, and take care. And
Sure. Look forward to. Thank you very much. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. Good evening.
Bye, Shanaz.
Bye-bye. That actually takes us on to our second guest, and Thomas, thank you for that. I think before I actually talk about our second guest, I think some of the things that have been discussed there, and I've seen some of the comments written on, is the fact that it is extremely interesting times when it comes to looking at power, looking at where we are in the global world. And I think people that are living in the United Kingdom, our relationship with Europe. And I think one of the things that Thomas said towards the end is that we've forgotten the collectiveness, the conscious collectiveness from the Second World War. And those people that went through that, the horrors that they went through that, is something that we cannot ignore. Now, our second guest also requires a little introduction. It's Niall McCrae, a former senior lecturer in mental health and a trade union man. He's a writer and advocate of democracy, free speech, and joins us now. Good evening, Niall. How are you?
Good evening, Shanaz. Very well, thanks. I've had a bit of problems with my internet tonight, so hopefully it will hold out for the short time we're on.
I hope so. It's interesting. I too come from a background of education. I'm a former lecturer, and one of the things I was thinking about when I was driving back home for this evening's program was the kind of dialogue that we have with young people when it comes to conscription. And one of the things, I don't know if you were listening, that our former guest Thomas spoke about was our sort of collective and also our consciousness and our own understanding of the world around us, and the word sovereignty came into it, the word national pride came into it. So it's all very interesting. I mean, You're former head of MI. You're a former lecturer, is that correct? Or are you still lecturing?
Yes, I'm no longer lecturing now. Yeah, I left about two years ago. Yeah.
Now, former head of MI6, Sir Alex Young, has said that British government should compel Britons to give their service, and government ministers have said that there is no plan for conscription to be made mandatory. I'm just reading some script here. Do you think that there are plans for conscription in Britain? And if so, what shape or form do you think it's going to take?
Well, I think there's clearly priming by the mainstream media towards conscription. And I think there's also economic policies by the government, which I see as being facilitators of conscription. And the general public will tend to believe that war, or the threat of war, is what leads to conscription. But I think, at least today, I think it's the other way around. I think conscription is to lead to war. I believe war is coming, and I don't say that with any relish. I just think that that's the way things seem to be brewing. Now, so economic policies of the government, we've got this green revolution with Ed Miliband, which they know is destroying jobs. The other economic policies of this government are closing businesses all around the country. And unemployment is a deliberate strategy, because once people are unemployed, they will jump at the chance of a secure, paid employment. And our previous guest was talking about the Second World War, and I think that there's some perhaps even fond or some rose-tinted memories of national service, which applied in Britain in the 1950s. There's still many people around today, the older generations that participated in that. But the difference is, in the 1950s, is that they just come through the Second World War, and national service was all about how you would keep the peace. Whereas now it's the opposite. I think it's very definitely war is something which is being built up as something that's going to happen sooner rather than later. The other thing that I think is being used to contribute to the potential conscription is the mainstream media. And you may have seen all the almost hysteria around this television drama called Adolescence. And I wrote an article about that 2 weeks ago, on how I believe one of the real purposes of this adolescence program was to get people thinking about the energy and aggression of young males, and how that could, should be channeled.
I think I agree with you in the sense that some of these programs are not just made overnight, and they don't come about overnight either. One of the things that is quite interesting from our previous conversations and what we're talking about now is the fact that young people, there seems to be a focus on young people. But these young people that we're talking about now, they are very different to the young men and women that we spoke about in the 1950s. We've actually lost Niall, so hopefully he'll join us in a few minutes. But it gives me an opportunity to try and just to try and look at some of the things that that we have spoken about in the last few minutes. Now, if we are to believe that it's not something that we've spoken about overnight, that there is a reality behind conscription. But conscription only comes about in countries where they believe that they haven't got enough people to be able to fight a war, whether it's a war that is real, it's created, it's going to happen, but they don't believe that they've actually got the manpower or the personnel or the people to be able to do that. So what they are trying to do is to find a way, an avenue to bring those people through mandatory conscription. I think we've got Niall back. Niall, I was just saying, in terms of if we look at the young people that we had perhaps in the 50s, straight after the Second World War, and then the young people that we're talking about now, there's a real difference, isn't there, in terms of people's opinions on war, our own sort of consciousness, and of course our experience. And don't forget, we had in 88, 89, we had the Iraq War, and look what happened there. But just going back to what you said in terms of a narrative being created and programs like Adolescence that don't just happen overnight, do you think there's a real sense of getting people to panic about these young people that are out of control, and we need to tunnel them into a certain discipline, and that being to enlist them in some way, whether it be mandatory or otherwise? Otherwise, they're going to be doing things that we've no control over. Do you think it's as crude as that?
I do, and I think that there's various problems in society which are
I think we just keep losing Niall. I mean, the problems in society, and I do want people to put their comments on this. Do you think that by moving these young people or sort of getting them collectively dealing with the problem by putting, through conscription and making it mandatory for them to join because we can't control them, do you actually think that this is a way forward? Or should our communities and our society in general look at maybe the root cause of some of these things? I would perhaps put it to you that it's a fact that let's look at it back to front. The fact that we think that the only solution to some of the problems that we have out there, and they're no different to, I would say, no different to problems that we've had for many years, and perhaps it's different in the sense that they are slightly different, but young people have always gone out and rebelled for one reason or another. That's part of the way that we are. We've got Niall back. I don't know if you've heard what I was saying. I was just thinking that, do you think it's just an excuse to remove certain people off the streets, a form of, if I can use that word, ethnic cleansing, in the sense that we move these troubled people, we may be the cause of the trouble, and we just throw them in there and say, right, well, you can actually now be the people who are going to go out there and be killed. Because let's be honest here, Niall, it's very different to the First and Second World War. We've got drones, they're almost on games. These people that we're going to put out there with very little knowledge and experience and desire, if I can use that word, they're not going to come back, are they?
Well, certainly the war in Ukraine at the moment has shown that in many ways warfare hasn't changed much since the First World War. These are killing fields. But yes, you are right. There will be people working for the Army, the Air Force and Navy who are just sitting in an industrial state somewhere in this country aiming drones at people. And I imagine that's what the many people in society with sort of neurodiversity diagnoses will say that they can't.
I mean, in our last broadcast was about resilience, and how do we feel that resilience in terms of modern young men and women would be in a battlefield situation? And I hope Niall's going to be able to help us answer that. I mean, our resilience, if we have no desire, if we don't particularly want to be there, I mean, we're seen as a problem and we're put there to try and resolve that problem. Interesting. I mean, Uncle Hoz has put a comment up there. He says, I don't think the government should be telling people what we need to what we need you to go to construction at the end of the day. People should be allowed to have a free choice to join the army. I mean, one of the great things, I have family members who were in the army. In fact, I have existing family members in the army, and they joined because they wanted to be there. They joined because they wanted to represent their country, and we talked about national pride and sovereignty. If people aren't there by choice, then it's going to be a real problem. You continue to say we shouldn't be forcing anyone to do anything when the year 2025. Anyone that wants to join the military should do freely and not by force. Now, yes, in an ideal world, but it's not as simple as that. I think one of the things that's come from the conversations that we've had this evening, and I think previously as well in the previous the broadcast, is that there seems to be an actual narrative that has been created. It's not because we see a war that is going to happen, and many of the people that we speak to, I speak to, and I'm sure the viewers tonight will speak to, if there was an actual threat to the United Kingdom, many of our young people would enlist. They would want to protect their country, but that is not what this conscription is about, is it? It's more complex than that. And the three main parties that actually benefit from them, I've been told, are the politicians, and you've got those people that are actually making the war machines themselves. Then the two main ones. These are the people who are profiteering. So it's more of maybe a business that's been created, and that's why the narrative has been created. One of the things that I do want people to ponder about is, because we're talking about Europe, and are we moving forward with Europe in the sense that we want conscription to become mandatory in those countries, in these countries? Is it because of the fact that we have a certain change in our political climate? Now, we're the Workers' Party. We believe that people have freedom of choice. I don't believe that I am, or many of my friends would be against enlisting if there was a real threat to the country. I'm not talking about threat to the country that we've caused, but a threat to country, a real threat to the country. But if we have no real sense of trust in the people that are making these decisions, then where does that leave us? And I think that is one of the questions that I would have liked to ask Niall. And if there's anybody out there that would like to answer that question, and the question is that who are making these decisions, and do we trust that decision-making power? Is it the government making these decisions? Is there some kind of collective voice out there that is making these decisions? What I wanted to be able to do is that ask many of these questions, and I think it's important for people to be able to have this discussion. Conscription itself is quite a scary thought, in that conscription in the sense of it becoming mandatory is quite a scary thought, and many young people, I believe, would say no to it just because of the fact that it is mandatory. One of the other questions that I wanted to also ponder about is the polls. Now, with our previous guest with Thomas, we did say that the polls show that people are 50-50 about this. How are these polls created, and who actually takes part in them? I want to ask these questions because I think it's very, very important that we ask these questions. Now, I want to come back to this a little bit later on, but before we hopefully get Niall back, because we have got a little bit of time on the programme, we have got some elections coming up locally, and we at the Workers' Party have got a number of candidates across the country who are standing in these elections. And while these are local elections, we do have a by-election for an MP seat in Runcorn. Peter Ford is there. We've got a by-election in Rochdale, Balderstone and Kirkholt. Laura is standing there for a council seat. And then we also have a mayoral election in Doncaster. Essen Jamil is actually is standing there, and then we've got some other county council elections as well in Burnley, in Tamworth, in those areas. I think Niall is back. Niall.
Yeah.
Niall, you're a very difficult person to get hold of.
Yeah, I'm so sorry, and to the audience. Do you know what I think it is? I'm going to blame Keir Starmer for this.
Are you?
Because he has, that BitChute and Gab have left the UK.
Yes.
So I've had to get a VPN, and I think that might have been causing the difficulty, because I've never had this before.
Yeah. Now, what I was just talking about in your absence was I was discussing opinion polls. One of the things that I discussed with the previous guest, Thomas, was that we have these opinion polls, and the question I was asking, should we have faith in them, and are there polls that have been created to try and move that narrative forward? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I'm glad that you said that about the untrustworthiness of polls. I mean, you remember in the COVID regime, whatever new thing they were going to do with lockdown or mandates, whatever, there was always 74% public support for it in the reported in the media, or round about that. But, a government minister, Nadeem Zadawi, was actually running YouGov at the same time that that he was in the cabinet, which is just a total conflict of interest. So I don't really support. I don't take opinion polls very seriously, because I think that if the government wants to bring in conscription, then it will, opinion polls will be produced to show the required level of public support. But I think it's probable that the British society is very naive at the moment about conscription, and if they're asked questions, they won't really know exactly what that will entail. I think it's probably quite divided.
Do you really think so, Niall? Do you really think that the British population is still quite naive about it? I mean, again, in terms of polls and the things that are coming out, it's about 50-50. People are not sure, but. Is it naivety, or is it because of the way that the questions have actually been put together? I mean, if I was to ask you, Niall, that are you proud? I'm assuming you're an Englishman, yeah. So so are you a proud Englishman? You probably say yes, I am. But then if I was to say, well, the fact that you are, if we were to go to, if there was a war or a threat of a war, would you be willing to represent your country? Then it's a playing on people's emotions, isn't it? I think
that they will exploit lingering patriotism, and there's a lot less patriotism in Britain now than there was even like 10, 20 years ago. And I think people will quite openly say, I'm not going to fight for Keir Starmer's government. I'm not going to fight for the British establishment. I'm not going to fight for King Charles. That thing from the First World War of for king and country, I don't think that would apply very much today. But there is some still people who would want to do that, fight for their country, fight for the union.
There's nothing wrong in that, is there, Niall? I mean, if somebody to have that opinion or to have that feeling to want to fight for your country, would you say there's anything wrong in that? I mean, I'm just put that question out there.
Well, this is why I said that I think there's a lot of naivety about conscription, what it means. So people are being led to believe that Putin and Russia are our mortal enemy, and that once Putin's finished off with Ukraine, then he'll be threatening other countries in Europe. So I think there's probably people that think, Britain needs a bigger army because we've only got 50,000 or something like that. So yes, we need a bigger army. We need to let Putin know that we've got a proper
the might of the British army. Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, or you think of all the pride in Britain's military history and so on, and and just how much denuded the army and armed services have been in recent times. But there's also been a big push to get younger generations into the army using quite woke recruitment campaigns.
Yeah.
And I think that younger people, certainly the graduate class, will be enticed to sign up to fight for Western values, this freedom and diversity and equality. So different ploys will be used for different sectors. But one of the biggest things on which people are naive, Shanaz, is I hear people say, oh, there's no way most British people will agree to conscription now. But that's a ridiculous statement, because a conscript by definition isn't given a choice. You see that, and that is a misunderstanding that's come from decades of comfort, a peaceful society that we've had since the Second World War. People really don't understand just what conscription means. Conscription is basically a form of slavery with mortal dangers. If there's a war, as the Ukrainian male population, some of the female population too, have discovered, is a meat grinder.
And I mean, it makes me wonder in terms of how much of a narrative has been created and how much effort has been put through our media. And we know what's happening with media. And one of the things that we face as Workers' Party on a daily basis, we don't even get a mention in a list of candidates, never mind an actual voice on the podium. I mean, George felt it stronger than most people. I myself was a candidate in general election, and if we got a mention, it was like we were just amazed that we were actually listed, never mind a voice. But how much of an effort do you think that the government and other people, if I could say people, or let's just say machinery, be put behind all of this in terms of into a reality? Do you think that there's a lot of that going on, or do you think they're going to just play it by ear and maybe develop it as time goes on?
It seems to me that the Scandinavian countries that you were discussing earlier are being used to sort of kickstart this major push for conscription. So it started in countries like Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and the Baltic states. And it will spread from there. I mean, Germany is openly talking about following the Swedish model for conscription. So Germany, you can't get more major country in Europe than that. So I think it will spread from smaller countries, and that will give people a sense of trust in the idea of conscription, that liberal, progressive, advanced countries like Sweden have brought it in.
Yeah. I mean, we know that the British government wants to prolong the NATO proxy war with Russia. Do you think that this grandstanding, and how do you think this is grandstanding, and how do you see this playing out in the next weeks and months ahead?
Well, I've got a rather controversial speculation on that, because all eyes are on Ukraine. Everyone's talking at the moment about the possible peace deal, and Trump's involved, of course, and all of the kind of momentum around conscription is being built around facing up to Russia, and that's what everyone is focusing on. But actually, one of the reasons for America wanting to get out of the Russia-Ukraine war is America has its eyes on other potential conflicts, most notably Iran, and that's been brewing up as well. And I think that Israel is always involved in the wars in the Middle East, isn't it? America doing the dirty work for Israel. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a false flag event in the Middle East, a major false flag event that would cause, a ruction in the Islamic world, fire up the Sunni Shia divide. That would bring Iran into war with against likes of Saudi Arabia, which of course would be on the US Western side. Nobody's really thinking about that at the moment because all the focus is on facing up to Russia. But it might not be Russia. And by the very nature of world war, because that's what I think we're leading towards, World War III, is that it will involve many regions of the world. It won't just be a fight against Vladimir Putin.
I think it's quite interesting you saying that. I think viewers may be aware, if you're actually following social media and the media that we can almost trust, is that if you look at what's happening in the last sort of 24, 48 hours between Pakistan and India and what's happening there, you're quite right that there are many different scenarios to think about, but we're somewhat pushed to think about Russia of this superpower and this sort of a state that we need to control. And the only way to do that would be through conscription and doing that. I've only just remembered, I was thinking of 3 parties that actually profiteer from war, and bankers, we are told, always, and then politicians. And the third one is actually the people that make the arms. So they themselves are the people that actually benefit from them. So there's a whole mechanism behind it, and profiteering is a word that we sort of throw about. But in reality, it's about power, isn't it? And how we're engaging with each other in terms of countries. And you mentioned Saudi Arabia, you mentioned Iran, you mentioned the Shia Sunni scenario as well. Somebody just put up Al-Aqsa Mosque, then blame it on Iran, the Third Temple. So it just goes on and on and on, doesn't it? It's quite...
Something that I know that you wanted to ask me earlier, and I apologize for the trouble I've had with the internet tonight, was about resilience and about whether the British youth can be sort of made ready to fight. Now, I would answer that by saying that that's not the point. The point of war, the point of what I believe is coming as a potential Third World War, is a population cull, just as the First World War was. When the First World War happened, that was at the height of this new sort of phenomenon that was of eugenics, which had taken in all of the intelligentsia and the politicians, and this sense that there's too many people, or too many of the wrong type of people, working class, oiks. And the First World War was never really adequately explained, was it? How those millions of men had to go and fight in the mud in Flanders and perished in that most dreadful carnage. And that is happening in a sort of microcosm in Ukraine at the moment, where that country has lost hundreds of thousands of its men. The Russians, of course, have been losing men to war. Kills. I mean, that's an obvious thing, isn't it? But it kills conscripts. It kills people who never really wanted to go into the army or the navy or the air force, but find themselves forced into doing so. And
there's a certain class of people, a certain group of people. And if we go back to, I just wanted to finish it on this note, Niall, is that adolescence, you gave the example of that, this group of people, the youth that we can't control, let's discipline them all and let's get them to do this. That it's a form of ethnic cleansing, isn't it? You are actually getting rid of the problem by just getting rid of them, aren't you? We talk about profiteering and we talk about the Black Rocks and the BA systems and all that, but the very dark, sinister side of me thinks that it's more than that. Profiteering is not just about money, is it? It's more than that. It's the poor people, as Hozza said. It's those people, the most vulnerable of our societies, that are there on the ground. It's not going to be
absolutely
all the children and those children, is it?
Of course, it will be the poor that are targeted, and the poor will be made poorer by the economic policies of this government, which are, and that's not just the Labour government, that's all governments, all the Tory governments, Labour governments of the last 2 to 3 decades.
Yeah.
Now we are certainly getting into a severe problem of unemployment, which has been kind of held off for a while, but now AI and technology is really biting. The climate scam is destroying jobs, and this is being done deliberately to create this large pool of lower class people, or useless eaters, as the scientific advisor to the World Economic Forum, Yuval Noah Harari, calls them.
Yes.
Who will be sent off to fight in some medieval style conflict somewhere, and the graduate classes will probably be able to find military positions that don't endanger them, or
a way out, or a way out. They will find a way out, won't they? They're not going to be. They're not going to be there as the foot soldiers, almost sort of pawns in that chess game. Who we know.
I believe it will be the lower classes again that are sent off to fight for a war that they don't understand. You know, whether it's Russians they're fighting or Iranians, black, Muslim, white, lower class males, but possibly women as well. And we've seen that with Scandinavia, how gender equality is now being emphasized in conscription in Denmark and Sweden. Yeah. So it could actually bring in women as well, but certainly young males will be the target, because it's generally young males that offer the most potential opposition to the regime. Yeah.
Thank you, Neil. We are going to bring the programme to an end, and despite the technical hiccups, I think we've managed to be able to. We've had an absolutely fantastic conversation, and I hope that you will join us in weeks to come. A good evening.
Yeah. Well, thank you in the audience for your patience.
Thank you very much. So thank you for that. Despite the technical hiccups that Neil faced, I think it's quite interesting to see that there is an array of actual opinion, and whether we believe the polls out there, whether we believe that this narrative has been created by a collective narrative that's been created, it is quite interesting. I did mention that we do have the local elections. If you're out and about, it would be amazing if you could actually join us, and you can leave a message through the chat if you're in any of those areas, whether you're in Runcorn, whether you're in Rochdale, whether you're in Doncaster, whether you're in the Birmingham areas, if you're in Burnley, in any of those areas, if you can help out. Another thing that we'd like to be able to ask also is that if you'd like to be involved in the programme, if you'd like to send comments, if you'd like to come on, if you're somebody that's got a particular field that you want to discuss on this topic, we would welcome that. It is your program. We are the hosts of this program, and this program has actually been put together to try and get people to think more about what's going on here and to open up the conversation. Finally, we do have an event on the 10th of May at Bolivar Hall. The actual information is there. It's a victory day, and to defeat fascism. It is the 80th anniversary, and I think it was actually earlier on we had the conversation. It's about that collectiveness, about being able to celebrate and also to have that conversation. We have got some amazing people that will be speaking there. The information is there. It is Saturday, May the 10th, in Bolivar Hall, which is in London. I will be there, George will be there, and we hope to have many people from the Workers' Party members from the National Members Council, together with many wonderful speakers. I hope you have a wonderful evening. It was lovely to be asked to host this programme, and I hope in weeks to come that I join you again. Look after yourself.